right, welcome to the pod, Ryan O'Hanlon. He is a writer at ESPN. This is my summer pivot to the Unexpected Goals podcast. I'm going to call it now instead of Unexpected Points. It doesn't quite roll off the tongue in the same sort of way, I don't think. But this is my plan here. Thanks for joining me, man.
Thanks for having me. My guess is I'm the first guest you've had literally recording from his parents' basement.
Well, fantasy football guys famously actually live in their parents' basement. So maybe they have a dedicated podcast studio inside of their basement. But this is good because this leans into the imagery that we want to have here of our analytics guys in the basement. But the problem is you're not an analytics guy. Let's face it. Can I call you an analytics guy if you've actually played the game? Because that rules out, let's say, the initial objection to anything when you put numbers into sports is if you play the game, then you'd understand X, Y. Or this is being told to you by people who probably also didn't play the game. But you actually played the game. So that kind of rules out part of our clique.
I think that's true, but I feel like I earn some like nerd bona fides by being American and writing about European soccer mostly. Like that kind of like cancels out the fact that I played collegiate soccer. So I hope that like possibly gets me back in the club.
Yeah, no, I can see that. That's like an easy way to dismiss anyone that you don't have the same opinion of. Now, have you in written form pretended or at least not led on to the fact that you were American and maybe, you got the O in there. You could pretend maybe you're, you got a little Irish or something in you, and then they don't find out until it's too late after you've already sucked them in.
I guess I should try it because I feel like because I used to work at the Ringer and Grantland, and I was an editor at both of those places. So I worked on the NFL, worked on Major League Baseball, NBA stuff, and I'm like relatively fluent in those sports and kind of sort of the analytics, movements, revolutions, whatever you call them in those sports. So I tend to just like occasionally reference stuff in the ideas from those fields, I guess, when I'm writing about soccer, because soccer is kind of so far behind. So every time I do that, I'm giving myself away, even if my language isn't Americanized English, even though it definitely is, because there's a kind of British way of writing where it's like a very passive voice, and you kind of talk about some like having pace rather than being fast. And I don't really do that. So I next time I write, I should have them change my headshot, take my glasses off.
The glasses don't work. The glasses are a giveaway.
Yeah, no, the glasses are not good. This happened to me in another sport where I wrote this blog post like a week into the second half of the Major League Baseball season, and Aaron Judge had the worst wins above replacement of any player in Major League Baseball through that 1 week. So I wrote like a very clearly sarcastic blog post about how Aaron Judge had became the worst player in Major League Baseball.
Right.
And it caught on in the like Barstool did a blog post about, this nerd from the Ringer says Aaron Judge is the worst baseball player. And I literally I got an Instagram message 2 weeks ago from some guy with a screenshot of the article saying, "This you?" ? And all those people were like, "You're just a nerd in a cardigan and glasses. You don't know anything about baseball." So yeah, I guess I just offend everyone. It's kind of where I'm landing on.
Yeah, that makes sense. What is interesting the cross sport comparisons. I was even thinking about that the other day. Like internationally, obviously you don't have American football, but even NBA or basketball, it's more of a continental European thing. I guess China is pretty big now, but then soccer's not that big in China. And then maybe for South Asia, you have like cricket and some other stuff. And then maybe you have some interest in pure like degenerate gamblers and cricket and a bunch of other different places. But it's really like one sport for so much of the world takes such a huge focus that even making these cross-sport comparisons doesn't even make sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, then you get into kind of the idea of like the thing that's kind of hard about that are tricky, you know, when you're writing about the NFL, there's a lot of assumptions you can make that like, okay, someone reading my work like knows what the salary cap is and they understand like who these players are, and you don't need to like define what a division is. But when you're kind of writing about, especially when you're writing about European soccer and doing it for, let's just call it an American or a US based publication, there's all kinds of kind of considerations you have to make in terms of like what you should define. Do you have to sort of explain what relegation is? Do you have to like, can you cite this team from 15 years ago, or do you have to cite them and then explain who the team is? And then it's not even worth citing them because then there's just a paragraph that it's not about the piece at all. So like, I think it kind of ties into the same thing where I guess it's like, it's kind of an ongoing process of figuring out who your audience is. But since I'm writing for ESPN, at least I get a ton of English, you know, European readership. But I think, you know, my articles are on the homepage of ESPN.com. So I think I tend to, I don't know, I guess I tend to like assume that the readers have a general knowledge of the other American sports basically when I write.
No, that makes sense. And well, okay, let's talk about how I've diagrammed this interview will go, and we'll see if it ends up going this way or not. So first off, you mentioned ESPN, you mentioned you worked for the Ringer before. So you took the time and effort to write this book, which I'm going to hold up here, Net Gains, which you so generously got me a copy of, and I have read through here, Inside the Beautiful Games Analytics Revolution. Why write a book? It's hard enough now to write like beyond tweet form. If I could just do my job in tweet form, I think I would do that. Why write a book while doing this other work that obviously you're working for ESPN and other places where you can get these posts out there?
Yeah. So from like a selfish point of view, I felt like, you know, I was like working on the internet. I wasn't only in sports when I started, but I worked for a handful of other magazines, worked for a bunch of websites. I was mainly an editor, and being a kind of web editor, where you're kind of at the whims of news and stuff is, I'm not going to say it's thankless, but it's like a grind. You kind of always have to be on, always, you know, you're more at the whims of when your writers are filing as opposed to like you kind of making your schedule. And honestly, I felt kind of burnt out. And I was at this time, I started to do I kind of did a ton of soccer writing at the Ringer while I was also an editor over there, especially during the World Cup. And it seemed like people were somewhat interested in this kind of, I guess, alternative way of looking at the sport, you know, using data to try to, you know, being more kind of constantly acknowledging the random nature of the sport in the way I would talk about it. It seemed like people were interested, and the kind of writing path for me was appealing. And then the idea of like writing a book where it's like, you can take a much, you know, 10,000 foot view or whatever, rather than just reacting to a thing and then another game happens and that changes the whole narrative. So then you have a new thing to react to. So the idea of one, like spending more of my time writing, and then two, like being able to like take a large step back and write in a way where you can kind of digress and kind of grapple with sort of bigger ideas and kind of, you know, not what you're writing about doesn't change day to day based on what's happening in the world. I guess that really appealed to me, which I guess is kind of probably sounds weird to most people because writing a blog is a pretty daunting thing.
No, I think it's, I mean, there is a degree of permanence, even when it comes down to, I think, podcasting versus writing a post versus, you know, a tweet versus going even further to a book, where it's just the way we're conditioned, I think, naturally. And then also even further with all the different avenues that people have of getting the written word out there in very abbreviated form, that it probably becomes harder and harder to kind of like get over the hump. I mean, it's hard for me just to write things sometimes, just even in a post that's a few thousand words or something like that, getting over the hump. So I can imagine this being a more daunting task. Now, how I wanted to attack this interview is kind of similar to how I feel like you've put together this book. And maybe we can talk about your process, even thinking about that, is not a single character or character arc in here like you would maybe see like with the Moneyball or the Blind Side to a degree, you know, for what Michael Lewis has done. But you do have, is very much character based, I would say, as you've gone through this. And it's not just a, you know, a textbook on soccer analytics, and this is how you would apply it, and let's put a bunch of graphs in here and other things you're going here. It has a narrative through here. So that's how kind of I wanted to attack things as part of this. Was that your thought, that it could be, you know, narrative based but not one arc the entire time, in order to pull in these different strings that you wanted to get into the book?
Yeah, I mean, when I was kind of batting around ideas in my head of writing a book, I thought it would have to be kind of the Moneyball type structure, where it's like one character, one story, and then you can kind of hang all the different things off it. And I think luckily my agent, I kind of was talking through some of my ideas, and he was like, why don't you just do all of them? Because I think you're less at the whims of whatever happens with that team, right? Like, so if I, Fulham, for example, they have Tony Khan, who, the son of the owner, well, he's also his dad is the owner of Fulham as well as the Jaguars, and he kind of talks very outwardly about how he's a data guy and runs his team off of data. You know, that could that have been a book where I went and followed Fulham around for a year? Sure. But one, how many people are going to want to read a book where you kind of have to sell that a little bit about that it's about Fulham? But also, two, it's kind of, I could get lucky and Fulham could be like amazing, and they could also be awful, which would also be good, or they could just be kind of like neither, and then it's like the narrative propulsion isn't there. So by focusing on all these different people, I think one, it makes it kind of makes the book a little more textured, I guess, and also lets me play around a lot more with kind of the narrative that I'm telling throughout the book, if that makes any sense.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think maybe you have a section in here when we'll talk about Jesse Marsh as part of this thing here, but I guess it's really hard with managers too. As you know, I've come to learn as I've been following it more and more. It's like, you could be gone next week. These guys, like, it's just crazy how often the chaos turns, and how it's funny to me how they're just shuffling around to different jobs, the same guys, where you see that to a degree in the NFL, but normally it requires, unless you're a big brand name sort of guy, normally it requires a demotion of sorts to like a coordinator type of position, and then you work your way back up. But you know, there's a lot more here where guys are just moving from one position to the next, but that the stability is maybe not there. Now, the first character that you talk about in here, you know, in a way, is just looking at yourself here. So let's talk a little bit about your history here, being a player in the sport. And then, you know, we got into a little bit as far as how you made that transition to being a writer and analyzing the sport. But why don't we talk about your background then?
Yeah, so I played pretty competitive soccer growing up. I played a bunch of sports growing up, and then realized I was a lot better at soccer than basketball and baseball. Baseball in particular, I was on a travel team, and I thought I was good. And then I saw a guy throw a curveball for the first time, and I was just like, there's no way I'm ever going to be able to do that. So yeah, I'll stick to using my feet instead. And then, you know, played on travel teams, had a bunch of kind of personal training. And there's this little story in the book. My dad, you know, not someone who you would associate with kind of analytical thought, I guess. I was on like the best travel team on Long Island, and he heard me say that I was bored after one of the practices. So he started getting me training with this guy who told my dad he would refund him completely if he wasn't satisfied, which was all my dad needed to hear. And then after that, this guy had me join another team that we were better than. We would constantly beat. But my dad like watched the way they played and felt like, wow, like the way they're playing, they're controlling the ball, they're passing. The only reason we're beating them is because our kids are just bigger currently. Mm-hmm. And in like faster, 2 years,
probably. Yeah,
exactly. The team that can control the ball and move it up and down the field, with some kind of patterns, like is going to be the better team. So I quit the team and went to this worse team. And, all the parents on the team I was on were like baffled. They were just like, what the hell is wrong with you? Like, you're turning your back on us. Like, we're the better team. And then sure enough, the team I went to became one of the better teams in New York. I followed that eventually, played in college at Holy Cross, very mediocre Division I soccer program, never made the NCAA tournament. My claim to fame is that I won my last 4 games in college, but our record was so bad that we didn't even make the postseason tournament. Because, normally in college, you lose your last game, right? That's typically what happens. Outside of the bowl game system in college football. But I was able to win my last 4 because our record was so terrible that we didn't even get into the Patriot League tournament my senior year. And then after that, got into journalism, eventually got into sports journalism, and then eventually started writing about soccer, basically.
So if you've gone to Holy Cross and you interview at the Ringer or Grantland at the time, does Bill Simmons just give you a job on the spot? Is that all you need to do? Your resume is just a blank sheet of paper with education, Holy Cross on there, and he's like, you're in?
Yeah, pretty much. We say God is on our side, and then handshake, and then I immediately am working there.
Special thing. Okay, one of the things you talked about here, which I found fascinating, and is the difference in this like development path. And part of it is what you illustrated there in a way, because like a focus on games, a focus on winning probably, which for the uneducated or unfamiliar soccer parent probably, it's like, is our team winning or not is probably like an indication maybe of coaching or things like that, or how well you're playing there. Same thing for kids. I know even with my 7-year-old, we're going through some different soccer things. He's like, are we going to win or not? Like, that's very important to him. And in some ways, he might even rather be on a team that wins if he's not involved as much than a team that loses. But when you talked about moving up through like this college system as opposed to like the academy system at a lot of different places, there's just much more of a focus on playing in games as opposed to training and getting better for the next level. Would you say that's still the case in a lot of American soccer, or has it changed a lot? Maybe comment on that a little bit there. Am I describing it correctly?
Yeah, you're describing it correctly in general. I think it's changed drastically since I was playing. Now at least all the MLS teams have academies. And then there's a bunch of other clubs that have academies that are essentially associated with MLS. And it's less, we kind of just like copied what was being done in England basically in the 90s. And if you had a British accent, you could just convince suburban parents to let you coach their kids. Like, I'll never forget, I was like practicing like diving headers at age 10 with this English coach. And it's like, that's like learning how to dive and head the ball, one beyond the sort of
headers
issue.
Are like outlawed until you're 15 or something.
It's also
now,
like not a skill that is it's not like this like very subtle fine-grained skill that only certain people can learn, like you can learn that at like age 20. It like it's just such a waste of time to be doing that. So yeah, I think that's generally kind of how it was, but we sort of had a little bit more of like a melting pot of other countries' development systems influence us. And then all the other, because soccer is so competitive and so lucrative across the world. I think just the kind of the development, the way players are being developed everywhere has, I think, gotten a lot more efficient, even if it's still incredibly inefficient. And a lot of it has bled over to the US, but I think it's still, the general thing about winning versus, learning the things that'll actually make you better when you're older. I think there's still a pretty big tension with that. Probably, it's not only in the US, I think probably true at a lot of clubs too. You essentially need the head of the club to be like, yeah, we care more about playing 5v5 possession with no goals for 2 hours than we do like winning the youth cup, or something like that.
Yeah. No, I'm getting a little bit off even what I was expecting to talk about here, but I think there's an interesting concept where at least I have the perception, or I had the perception, that soccer in America is more of a, let's say, middle class, although middle class is always hard to define in America, because basically if someone is like making $2 million a year, depending upon where they live, they'll call themselves middle class. And if someone's making slightly above the poverty line, they'll basically call themselves middle class, because there's like a negative association with calling yourself rich or poor, any of these sort of things. But I would say like healthy middle class to upper middle class to, you know, not as much as sports like, let's say, tennis, where it takes a really intense training and regimen, but there is a lot of that can be paid for, essentially, as opposed to developed. And I think as part of that, I kind of lost the perspective and then I'm regaining it now when watching international soccer, is like how many of the players are not from middle class backgrounds, right? Is that happening more here in the States, that we're able to get more kids up through the pipeline who are not middle class, who have opportunities if they don't have that sort of financial means? Or is that still, do you think that's a difference between America and other places?
I think that's a big difference. It's better. Like the MLS academies will pay for the training. Like they basically, you're on scholarship. So like if you can't afford it, you don't have to pay. Right. But there's all these other clubs where you have to pay. And then there's the question of like, well, how do you get identified by an MLS team if you're a kid who's, you know, both of your parents are working multiple jobs, and how will they even know about this stuff? So they kind of, you know, there's still so many kind of like holes, I guess, in the net in terms of trying to identify soccer players. And you're absolutely right about it's absolutely true that the kind of socioeconomic profile of soccer in this country is drastically different than it is everywhere else. You know, everywhere else, it's like, why is it so popular? It's because there's barely any rules. You just need like something round to kick, basically, and then you can play. But here it's kind of, well, you need the cleats, you need a car or a van to drive you to practice, and then you need to pay for the coach. And, you know, that automatically eliminates all kinds of kids from being able to play. And I think, you know, that makes soccer a sort of increasingly white sport, just because of the way those things, you know, race coincides with kind of the socioeconomic strata. And I think even in the US, like I once did a story, like you can make an argument that the Mexican national team is the most popular sports team in America, just given the amount of Mexican Americans there are, and how they're all united by a love for the Mexican national team in a way that like there can only be so many Yankee fans or something like that.
Well, there's so many sports in America too, so yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But like there's still like the number of Mexican Americans and, you know, Central Americans and South American ethnicity people in the U.S. playing soccer is massive, but on the U.S. national team, it's still like a mostly white team, and there's like a very very small, compared to the number of people that play soccer, Mexican and Central American influence. So yeah, you're totally right that's like a big that's one of the big. Not that our best athletes don't play soccer. I don't love that line of thinking that comes out every 4 years. It's more like
it's a good cope. It's a good cope, at least. Let's face it. So,
yeah, exactly. It's that the kind of way that the ladder is set up. It's just like eliminating such a large portion of the country, much of which like has a large passion for playing this sport.
Yeah. I feel like, again, I don't know why I'm getting off these tangents here, but maybe even just playing more, you know, I don't know what you call it, urban street soccer, you know, just on the damn concrete, you know, it's actually better than probably playing on like thick grass someplace anywhere. And then it's literally like pick up basketball, you know, you just have the ball and then everyone can play. But that culture, I guess, hasn't really developed here.
Yeah, it's starting to a little bit. I mean, you know, in LA, I play pickup soccer all the time, but that's because I just like know soccer people because of, you know, what I do for a living. But I think, you know, I think one of the interesting things with this, like in parallel to all of the American sports, is like this isn't an issue in American sports, right? Because it's like we're not competing with other countries to develop NFL players. Basketball, you're kind of seeing, right, that the rest of the world is kind of catching up with basketball. I think probably because the rest of the world kind of understands how to develop athletes maybe a little more than we do in the US, where it's kind of just go out there and play. The best kids will rise to the top.
Well, I think soccer might even be a big factor there. It's the guys who kind of like
Yeah.
grow out of playing soccer.
Yep.
They probably are pretty good, right? They're probably pretty good
Yep.
soccer players up until a certain age once they grow out of
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But so there's been a lot of research into like, can you predict who will be a good soccer player, right? And that, unsurprisingly, it's like impossible to predict what 13-year-old is like going to be a world-class soccer player. One of the things some research has found, basically, there's a thing called game intelligence, which you can kind of measure by like doing various tests to kind of see what decisions a player would make and kind of how they can scan their environment to even see what decisions are available and then what decisions they make. That's kind of like the thing that unites all of the best soccer players. And what they found, I guess, in some of the studies trying to find any correlation, like the amount of unstructured play you did growing up with soccer has like a pretty big predictive factor in becoming like a great soccer player. So you kind of then get into the question of like, in the US, we might suddenly be creating this system where everything is very systematized and no one's getting the unstructured play that is actually very important in terms of developing players. So
Yeah, no, I can see that. I mean, it's interesting because even now when I'm looking at some of these soccer teams for my kids, they have like there's teams that, it's still very rules based, even when it's not going to be a team that just has one athlete going and scoring. But those rules, like there's an upper limit, I guess, to how good you can be by just following the rules as opposed to doing something extraordinary, especially when you're competing against such a big talent pool. I'm also just wondering, again, these are just ideas popping into my head. I wonder if for basketball, it's easier to identify kids because they're just like big, like the kids who are just big, you can identify them a lot earlier as being potential basketball players. There's actually like tons of kids, including myself, who like played so much basketball as a kid. It was probably kind of wasting my time because I was never going to like reach the threshold that you would need. But there's really not like that threshold parameter when it comes to soccer as far as who can end up being a soccer athlete. Like obviously you have to be athletic, but there's not hard limits that there are in some other sports.
Yeah, I haven't forgotten everything I've written in the book, but a lot of the more specific statistics, I don't remember, but in the book, there's a study I mentioned that just kind of looks like the body composition of the population. It's like, I don't know, 1% of the global population has like the minimum body type required to play in the NBA. And with soccer, it's like 30% or something like that. So yeah, with basketball, it's like just being tall is like the main requirement to play. Not that, they're not incredibly skilled athletes too, but like the main predictor is your height probably. Well, with soccer, it's like, the number of people you could walk by on the street who like roughly have the body type that could be a professional soccer player is like, most of the people you walk by, I feel like.
Yeah, I mean, there are some guys out there you see it, but not as much. Yeah, I was thinking about that because, I mean, it's changed a little bit in the NBA because it used to be more dominant for big men. I think at one point in time, it was something like 1 out of every 10 people who are 7 feet tall in the world was like playing in the NBA at that point in time because it was really, you didn't need much at all to do it. But yeah, that's been part of my whole argument I've had with people about which sport has the best athletes. As a nerd, I'm just going to say, if you have the entire world playing a sport and so many people could potentially play that sport, then you probably have the best athletes playing that sport because there aren't those hard sort of limits. But I admit watching LeBron James do something at that sort of size is so like overwhelmingly impressive that makes a compelling argument. But I just have trouble seeing like when it's just limited to people who are that tall that would be the case.
Yeah. Speaking of me making people mad, before the World Cup final, I basically wrote a piece arguing that Messi is the greatest athlete of all time. Basically,
yeah,
kind of sketched out why he's the greatest soccer player ever, which is pretty obvious if you look at any numbers. He's the greatest goal scorer, the greatest creator, the greatest dribbler, and the facilitator all at the same time, while some other people measure up in certain categories, but across all five, like it's just ridiculous. And then I did what you said, where it's like Wayne Gretzky, like his stats are absurd, right? If he never scored a goal, he would have the most points in NHL history. But it's like, how many people on planet Earth can play hockey, right?
Yeah.
It's just like not as competitive. So what I landed on is like it's either Usain Bolt because his like
That was
when
the
you
other
look
one
at
I was going to mention.
the
That's the other I was going
progression
to
of
mention.
the
It's like,
world record, like
yeah,
it goes like that with him.
yeah, everyone can
Um,
run, basically. Yeah.
and anyone can run. So I think it's basically one of those two. And I think it gets into like, then you get into the argument of like, what is an athlete, right? Because yeah, LeBron James would like beat Messi at most other sports, but it's like we're just talking about how dominant they are at their sport compared to the level of competitiveness in the sport and the average person, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I like it. I mean, this is kind of again building these arguments around some analytical sort of thing. So, explain to me now then the transition towards, or is there even a transition of looking at the game through more of a numbers basis, or at least being able to frame arguments using that as an intelligent contextual point that you can bring in. I mean, it can be bad or it can be good. You know, numbers can definitely mislead, if not lie when you're bringing them in. Do you think you being American and we have these other sports where it's become a bigger deal that kind of helps you as a writer make that sort of part of what you're doing?
Yeah, it definitely played a role because I was, I don't know, I kind of started when I started doing a little bit of writing for Grantland when I was working as an editor at a magazine. Um, I was very, had read Moneyball, was reading all the, baseball writers that were, at that time, 2013 or whatever, every baseball writer is like fluent in analytics or sabermetrics or whatever you want to call it. It's like, it's just accepted that if you're writing about baseball, you're using at least a certain amount of data, I guess. And then it was becoming more prominent in the NFL with, I guess, like Football Outsiders around that time. Kind of DVOA was a popular, like kind of becoming popular at that point.
Was
With the
Barnwell there
NBA,
at the same time as you were there, or no?
yeah,
Yeah,
Barnwell
okay.
was there, so a ton of that. We had Kirk Goldsberry doing NBA stuff. So being exposed to that, it's like, okay, why is none of this happening in soccer as I'm kind of starting to write about it? So I started to kind of try to, if I was just writing a piece about why I thought this guy was good, I would try to mention a couple stats that I could find. At this time it was just like chances created or like shots attempted. But even that was like just a massive change compared to how the sport was being written about then. So I think seeing how people were, I think at the time using data in their writing, but also could still like produce writing that I felt was like good writing, so that it kind of like a light bulb went off in my head, right? Where it was like, okay, I'm aware of all these American sports and kind of the work that's being done there. And I've also been watching soccer my whole life. I've played it. So I think I have a little bit of a kind of understanding of the dynamics of how it works. Can I maybe meld these two things together?
Now, the first name that I put on here, other than yourself, to talk about potentially from your book is the story of Charles Reap, who I'd never heard of before. Talk about someone who kind of had a little bit of an arc there towards being hated. I guess eventually it's safe to say he was the first guy getting yelled at, except for not on the internet. Uh, Talk a little bit about him, why you chose him to focus on here, and how much did you know about him before starting to research this stuff?
Yeah. So Charles Reap, I think he like there's a chance he might be like the first like data analyst that was ever employed by, if we want to lump soccer in with the major American sports. He was like the first, like, this is what this guy did. He crunched numbers and helped us use those numbers to play a different way. So it was in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, up to the 90s. And he was an accountant with the Royal Air Force, saw or heard an Arsenal coach give a couple talks, and he talked about the sport kind of in coach speak, but in this way of like breaking the game down into component parts and kind of describing it in like systems terms. And it to Charles Reap, he was like, oh, I'd never heard anyone speak about sports like this. What if I kind of measure what's happening on a soccer field? And at the time, there was no data collection companies in the 50s.
Right.
No computers either. So he would go to games, and the stadiums back then, most of them didn't have, or the lights they had essentially would just light the field. They wouldn't light the stands. So he would literally wear a miner's helmet with a lamp on it. And he developed this shorthand to essentially record all the things that he thought mattered on a soccer field, and started doing it.
Probably
And then he came
endearing himself to his fellow fans with that on during during the match.
People definitely love that. He was definitely like a very like kind of fastidious and ornery guy, probably unsurprisingly based on what.
Well, I wouldn't have survived otherwise, probably. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so he kept doing this, and eventually, kind of the takeaway he became infamous for. He, studied how many a goal to goals, how many passes did they tend to have on average, and he found that the ones that led to goals had fewer passes, basically. So then from there, he decided, okay, all these teams that are just passing around with the ball in the back, kind of passing around the midfield, are like wasting their time. You got to just bomb it up the field, chase after it, and then just trying to do it over and over again, because because most goals come from short possessions. And so I think why he caught on and ended up working for a bunch of clubs. And I think why it caught on is because that was kind of a common way of playing, I guess, in England at the time. It kind of prioritized like physical, like you win games because you want it more than your opponent, and kind of just kicking it long and chasing after it kind of fits directly in with that, right? So some coaches kind of are like, oh my God, there's this data that tells us we should do this. I'm going to hire this guy. And so he gains a lot of purchase in the English game. But his issue was that what he didn't realize in doing his calculations is that longer possessions, like the percentage of longer possessions that lead to goals, was much higher than the percentage of shorter possessions that lead to goals. It was just that more shorter possessions led to goals because most possessions are shorter.
Right. So it was like a base rate sort of issue, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so eventually it becomes so popular. Exactly. It catches on. He works with Graham Taylor, who eventually becomes the England manager when England famously don't qualify for the 1994 World Cup. And so unsurprisingly, it like somehow Charles Reap gets blamed for all of this rather than like the other people that, hired Charles Reap or listened to him. And so he kind of developed this reputation as like the guy who's bad winning the soccer, essentially. There's a big bit about him in Jonathan Wilson's book, Inverting the Pyramid, the kind of history of soccer tactics. And then a bunch of other pieces about him. Even 538 did a piece about him, probably in like 2013 or something like that. And so that's kind of the mindset I had with him. Or the view I had of him, I should say. And then I found this paper by this guy, Richard Pollard, kind of defending Charles Reap's legacy, which is like something I'd never seen before. I thought it was just kind of assumed like, this is what happens when you're like too hard set in your beliefs of what the numbers show you, I guess. Mm-hmm. And the paper was a fine paper. I felt like it was a little biased, but I got in touch with Richard Pollard, and it turns out Richard worked with Charles Reap for a while. And he eventually became a character in my book, and we talked a lot, and he's kind of talking to me, and he's like, yeah, it wasn't only about like short passing and long passing. Like there's all this other stuff that Charles Reap and me studied. We developed this thing called yield, where we figured out the number of shots you have or the average likelihood that a shot from a certain location on the field turns into a goal. And I was like, that's like what expected goals is. Everyone talks about that now. Yeah. And then he talked about how you want to pressure the defense in their own defensive third, because a high turnover leads to goals way more often than a turnover elsewhere. And I was like, well, that's like what pressing is. That's like the most popular way of playing now. And so through meeting Richard, I learned all this other stuff. He showed me, he kept all of his records, and it kind of shed a new light, I guess, on the legacy of Charles Reap to me, and made this story way more nuanced and way more interesting. So I think I was able to write a chapter about him in a way that wasn't kind of just regurgitating all the stuff that had been written about him in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I enjoyed it. And again, as I came to the end of it, as you mentioned, then I'm kind of, I don't know what to think about this guy and his legacy, because it does seem a fairly silly error that you had mentioned earlier. But at the same point in time, I have trouble in soccer of being able to identify like the thing, let's say. Like for the NBA, like the thing was 3-pointers and layups, right? Let's figure out how we do
Yeah.
that because we're going to get the most. Like the thing in football, American football, is like pass the ball a little bit more often, be willing to take a lower success rate in order to have a higher average gain on some of these sorts of things. And when it comes to soccer, I don't know. And also, like, some of these things don't feel as good in a way. Like, it feels bad to miss more shots, but if you're getting more points per shot, then, like, it can feel really bad if you go down and you miss a whole bunch in a row. Like, it's deflating, but you're taking the higher chance. And then in soccer, like, in some ways, everyone really loves possession-based football. It's what the best teams do, who have the best players. But I guess for me, I would almost think that just intuitively that might not be the best way to play, because it does like lead into what feels better for some people, if that makes sense. Then maybe there is something to just kicking the ball down the field, at least a talent leveling sort of aspect to it.
Yeah, I think that there's a couple things. Like, I think you're right, and part of the issue with just measuring soccer is that it's so dynamic, right? Like, I use this example in my book. You could just both teams could just stare at the ball if they wanted to, right? For 45 minutes. Like, they could do that. While in the NFL, you can't do that because there's a play clock and there's downs and all that. NBA, there's a shot clock. I guess you could just refuse to shoot or whatever, but that's a little different. Baseball, like, you have to, the pitcher and the batter are kind of like in agreement that they're interacting with each other, right? In a baseball game. While soccer, it's like what happens on the field is so influenced by all the players around you, but also what the other team is doing. And then there's not just like a give and take of possessions, right? It's not like you get as many. I mean, by definition, you get as many possessions as the other team, right? Because every time it goes back and forth, it's a possession technically.
Yeah.
But like, teams have more possessions and more opportunities to shoot than their opponents do in a way that they don't in American sports, which makes it really kind of even hard to measure any kind of optimal way of playing. But I mean, I think expected goals is the thing that kind of most resembles the stuff you described, because the stuff you described, it's all like, it's pretty obvious if you like remove the kind of context you get from watching the sports growing up. If you just like an outsider, it's like, oh, shooting the shot that's worth 3 is better than the one that's like not worth 3. Or in the NFL, like, it's better to try to keep the ball than kick it to the other team and just let them have the ball. In baseball, like a walk being as valuable as a single, like that's only a recent thing that's been accepted by people. While in soccer, I think expected goals, basically the kind of thing I think that it showed that's obvious, but also kind of upended the way people think about the sport, is that all the best goal scorers, they score so many goals, not because they're particularly good at converting any individual opportunity into a goal, not because they're clinical finishers, which is a phrase you constantly hear on TV. I'm sure you've gotten used to it now. Or you hear, a guy, the announcer saying he's got to score there, or he should score here. Meanwhile, it's like a 20% chance of him scoring. What makes
somewhat similar to football sometimes, where you see guys and they say, "Oh, he would have been gone for a touchdown." I'm like, "No, he probably would have been caught like 70% of the time." But they always like to say that too, like, "Oh, if he would have broken that one tackle, he would have been gone." It's like, no, there are some other guys who probably would have caught him. But go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. But so the reason these guys score so many goals is because they're able to get shots off frequently from high value locations, and that's like being a good goal scorer is about all the things that happen before you shoot the ball, essentially, which it's obvious if you're not kind of steeped in the lore of soccer that, oh yeah, shooting more often and from closer to the goal is going to lead to more goals. But like, that's not kind of the way that we talk about all of the great goal scorers. And then you can kind of apply that to teams, and it's kind of the same thing, right? It's the best teams are the teams that create the most opportunities, not the teams that are the best at converting the opportunities into goals.
Yeah, actually, so the other name that I had on here was Michael Cayley here. So is he really I mean, you mentioned that obviously going back to Reap and others, that there was kind of this idea of expected goals, but is he really the popularizer of expected goals then?
I think he's the popularizer of it in like the public sphere, because he was a blogger at SB Nation, had a Twitter account that would post expected goal maps, but kind of at the same time, there was someone at Opta developing expected goals. This woman, Sarah Rudd, who used to work for Arsenal, was also doing a similar model, and a couple other people were. And then in hockey, I think at the same time, expected goals was being developed. But I think like on the internet, among people that were on Twitter and media people, like Michael Cayley definitely was the person who popularized the concept and made it like he was the one who was publishing expected goals totals for games, which were at the time, and as in, I don't know when he started publishing stuff, I guess 2012, there was barely any soccer data on the internet. You could barely find goals for teams, let alone players. So he was the first one who started just like putting the information out there for games.
Yeah, because it reminds me a little bit of like I can see the obvious reaction to it of, team A has 2.1 expected goals, team B has 1.3, but team B wins. And then you can just kind of like dunk on the concept of it. As I was trying to do this like scores for football games. And then people get mad at you at both sides. If they won and you said that they performed worse than what it said, they got mad at you and vice versa. I think over a long enough period, right? So if you're aggregating, it's based on all this aggregated data over a long enough period, it's pretty good as far as like originating for the truth. Well, what do you think are the weaknesses though, when we're looking at this in a similar way to looking at the weaknesses of any sort of expected metric that's based upon a full sample of people where individuals clearly can have a talent? We probably overestimate that talent. Confidence, that's the word that you hear really when you're watching. Oh, he's playing with a lot of confidence, which means ball go in, right? But there have to be some players who are actually better at ball go in. So how is like the dynamic between those two, and how do you think about that when you're using expected goals in your analysis?
Yeah, I think like there's probably like 4 or 5 players who I would be confident in being like, this person is a above average finisher. And by that meaning like he's going to score significantly more goals than expected per season. And even that, Harry Kane and Lionel Messi are 2 of them. And last year they both basically were like even with their XG for a season. And then this year now they're both above it again. One of the limitations is like they're not taking that many shots, right? So like you need just a way bigger data set of shots to feel confident. I think you'd probably know better than me the number that you would need to have any kind of confidence interval.
Too much for anyone to care about. Trust me.
Like longer than anyone's career, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
that's one thing, and then 2, it is still like, it's using a lot of assumptions. It doesn't, these models aren't yet taking into like body positioning of players. Some of them include velocity of pass and velocity of shot. Some of them sort of include height, but these are all kind of like proxy estimations based on similar situations in the past. So they are missing a lot of things. And then I think that there's probably one thing that I feel like does get missed. Like, I think when players, it'd be interesting if someone could study this. Like if there's a shot at the top of the box and a guy has a couple steps to kind of line up the shot and shape his body to finish it on the goal, I feel like those shots go in more often than kind of just if he doesn't have the time to do it from the exact same spot with all the other contextual factors that go into the XG model being the same. So I think stuff like that doesn't get included. So, there's all kinds of little, I guess, things like that. I think, I don't know, it's tough. I feel like I'm fighting this constant battle between being like, knowing that there's things that the models aren't picking up, especially even if you're looking at it over a long-term aggregate, but then also like, why do I have any confidence in me thinking that I can then look at the model like, okay, these things aren't being picked up, and adding it in, but then also like knowing that there aren't other things that aren't being picked up that I'm not adding in. So like doing all that, it's kind of like, I kind of tend to like lean toward trusting the raw or, sum total XG numbers more than my intuition a lot of the time. Cause that it's such a kind of, there's so much happens in soccer that like doesn't really matter. I know that I'm rambling, but yeah, I think, for an individual game, I think there's all kinds of stuff that can skew an XG model, right? That, a lot of people will like to look at fans will like to look at expected goals numbers for a game and either use it to be like, oh, well, it's obvious that our team should have won. We had 3 expected goals, but we only scored 1. Or they'll use it like, wow, we're so good at finishing. Look at the clowns we were playing against who couldn't finish. But there's also situations in a game where you're getting into the box and a shot isn't coming about it and coming from it. And like, you can also do a sort of expected possession value kind of estimation where it's like, well, if we're getting the ball into the box in this area this often, that's also going to lead to goals X amount of time, even if it didn't lead to shots, and then therefore didn't show up in an XG model.
Yeah, a lot of what you're saying makes a ton of sense as far as like being able to make some sort of subjective or intuition based adjustments to it. And I go back and forth on that a lot because I feel clearly if you just had someone who didn't understand what the actual, like, it didn't have a intuition based upon having studied like what the XG is calculated based upon these models. If you had them, watch every shot for a game, they'd be completely like way off as far as it, like trying to figure out exactly, as we talked about, they're like, everything should go in as long as they had a good line on sight on the goal. Yeah. And it's just some sort of mistake.
And all of their numbers would be skewed by what happens, right? Like if a guy like calmly bends the ball into the far post, you're going to think, oh yeah, that was like 0.75 XG, even though like it probably was like 0.1 or something like that.
Or the player taking the shots, they would have an assumption that the better player would have a higher XG even on the same sort of shot sort of thing. So I do think that's wrong. I've often thought if you did really understand things well and then you watched everything, maybe you could try to come up with minor adjustments, but I kind of lean towards you that I do think in aggregate, you'd probably be more wrong than right and actually hurting things unless you specifically studied certain instances, like you mentioned, of having like this kind of run up and pathway and that sort of way. And then you specifically took those out and then you modeled those and then you figured out whether or not you could break it in. But then it's like you're just improving the model as opposed to adding your intuition to a model. So I do think that's interesting. And the last thing that you mentioned, and we could talk about additional stats that have kind of been created after this, is the we should have won or not factor is highly influenced by the variance that comes into play that leads to the shot being there or not being there. Yeah, it's like, you might have had this unbelievably great chance, which gave you a ton of XG, but in reality, it came because it deflected randomly off of someone's knee, and then it ended up being right there, and the goalkeeper was wrong-footed and things like that.
Yep.
So what else are we looking at beyond XG if we want to give a better picture of what's going on in the game and like kind of like in this sort of vein of who should have won or who was the better team?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's kind of a couple ways to look at it. The complex way of looking at it, I mentioned it, expected possession value. It's kind of the new thing. There's another way of looking at it called threat. Created by the guy Kareem Singh, who now actually works for Arsenal. That was a clear net gains bump for him. He was a character in my book, and they got hired by Arsenal.
That's better branding. Threat, putting threat on there, I think. Then
and XT is the abbreviation. That basically is essentially just like valuing the territory of the field or the geography of the field, and it's like if the ball enters this area of the field, how often is a goal occur within the next 5 actions, and you can kind of you can calculate that pretty easily. I'm sure someone with your chops could do that. And XT is the very simple version. It's purely location based, and so every time you're kind of moving the ball into these dangerous areas, you can both award the player, like say a fullback is in a 0.01 XT area, completes a pass into like a 0.42 XT area. You could say, okay, he's added 30% goal probability to us, or added 30% of expected goals to us. But then these expected possession value models, they account for, depending on what data you have access to, they account for defender positioning. They account for the actions that occur in an area. So like a tackle in a certain area of the field might be worth more than a dribble or something like that. And you can kind of award the player based on all of those things. If you want to look at it more simply, I feel like one kind of thing that I'd never thought of playing soccer, but it's like very obvious now, right? Is that just like moving the ball into the penalty area is an incredibly important thing because one, it's closer to the goal. And then two, defenders just have to defend differently inside the penalty area. If they don't, they give up a penalty and that's 0.75 XG, say, for probably 3/4 of a goal. So I think as I've kind of started using this stuff in my writing, like good players tend to be players that carry the ball into the penalty area, pass the ball into the penalty area, or receive passes inside the penalty area, because that's the most crowded area of the field. The defense naturally doesn't want you to get inside the penalty area, even if that's not like a preset game plan, right? I think it just kind of happens naturally if you kind of look at where touches happen on the field. And it's also such a crowded area. So like the players that can find space in the penalty area have some kind of innate movement skill. The players that can identify the passes and complete the passes into the penalty area also have some kind of game intelligence and technical skill that, is important, even if it's not directly leading to a goal. So even just looking at like the number of penalty area touches that a team has versus the number of penalty area touches that they concede, I find that to be a pretty useful thing to kind of give you a sense of beyond the shots, like what teams were doing well. And then it also is just it gives you a bit of a story of what happened in the game beyond just the shots.
Yeah. Now I have some stuff I want to discuss with you after we're kind of going through these characters in the books about ideas that I have that could be completely wrong and just asinine to even think of. But I'm trying to disrupt soccer with some of these thoughts here.
I welcome it.
Okay, so speaking of soccer disruptors, let's move on here. Well, actually, one more thing I want to talk about for XG, and maybe this is again a discussion I could have as part of afterwards. What about the other side of the kind of shot equation, the goalkeeper in these situations? Like, what do we know about them in a way? Because in some ways, I might actually believe there's more, like I can believe there's more of a sustainable skill in preventing shots than scoring shots. Am I crazy for thinking that in a way that like you just physically guys can be bigger, right? could take up more space in a way and can position themselves in a way that like physically alters the dimensions of the goal and how they position themselves, where I'm just not sure for shooting. I think there's maybe less differentiation in how players are in there. Well, what do you think about that theory? I'll throw that out. This is my initial theory that could be ridiculous, but I'm going to throw it out there. Although I'm sure there's a lot of don't go in, clean sheets. Like I get driven. I've already driven insane.
Clean sheets.
I've already driven insane by clean sheets. Okay.
The Premier League, like they give their like Golden Gloves award to the guy that had the most clean sheets, and this year it was David De Gea on Manchester United.
And he's going to get like replaced, right?
Is like almost universally like despised by all Manchester United fans, which feels like could this be like the moment where we decide to find a better way to award?
Right.
Because it just gets award to the keeper. It's not like the keeper and the most used center backs get the Golden Glove. So I think your intuition is like that. I agree with that, partially because like we were saying about players not attempting enough shots. The good thing about keepers is they play almost every minute of the game because teams don't change their keepers. And they're facing all of the shots rather than taking, 10%, 15% of their team's shots. And
right. So you have a larger sample there also to judge them.
And there's also like the kind of Bill James thing of the difference between like a 275 and a 300 hitter is like not visible to anyone that watches baseball. It's only a matter of record, even though it has a massive effect on the number of games. And I think keepers are the same thing where, a lot of the keeper analysis is like, well, I remember this guy making like a couple amazing saves, when like you really don't know if a keeper's good unless you watch every single shot that he faces and then figure out what an average keeper would have conceded. I think the issues are I think determining the expected goals for a shot is not the same thing as determining the expected goals conceded for a keeper, because it's not the same thing.
Yeah.
So that's an issue. But, you know, there's post-shot expected goals, which also add in where the shot ended up on the goal. So you can use that to kind of determine, you know, if it's a shot from the top of the box in the upper corner, it's going to be worth more than obviously a shot from the top of the box that isn't on goal.
Yeah.
And so you can use that. And to me, that seems like it should be a very good way of determining shot stopping. But like, and I think it is over a long run of seasons, but by comparing goals conceded to post-shot expected goals, you still get pretty big variations from season to season, which I guess would make some sense because you can't control the shots you face. But I think it's kind of like, I don't know, what do you do with that, right? If it's like, well, this guy saved 11 goals this year, but then next year he's -1, is it like, is it a good stat then, right? Like, because it's like, I doubt he suddenly became a below average shot stopper. So like, what happened last year? So I think
maybe there's like a way of figuring out positioning or something. Like, what's the correct
so StatsBomb,
positioning?
Maybe I'm jumping ahead here. StatsBomb uses keeper positioning and defender positioning to kind of include that a little bit, because then you're getting right. Because then the keeper positioning is affecting where the player's shooting probably somewhat too. So the keeper maybe has control over where the players are shooting. So I agree with you, but all the kind of public models, they evolve from year to year, other than for like, you know, Allison in Liverpool is like saving like 8 goals above average every season. Everyone else, it kind of vacillates between season to season.
Yeah, you know, it reminds me, a sports analogy would be baseball, like fielding, where at least when I'm listening to the announcers on these games, the commentators, is like a spectacular looking save they'll automatically say like, oh, what an amazing save. And I'm always thinking to myself, well, was it that amazing? Like, I don't really know. And it's kind of like the whole Derek Jeter thing where he would win all these golden gloves. But if you looked at it, he was making the routine look spectacular because he was not as good at getting into position to be there in the first place. So I feel like that's my analogy there with goalkeepers, is sometimes they can make something that should look more routine look spectacular, and then people are awed by it. But the reality is they should have gotten more than a fingertip on some of these shots because of their positioning and other things.
Yeah, and there's also keepers that are really good at making shots kind of seem like they shouldn't be saved, I guess.
Right.
You know, slower shots into the corner or harder shots, and kind of like taking a millisecond extra to react and then not getting a hand on it. It reminds me of not, you know, I don't know if you want to talk about football, but I'm a Jets fan, and I had the pleasure of watching a lot of Sam Darnold. And, you know, you'd always see fans be like, well, like, look at him scramble and like make this like 50-yard throw across his body. And it's like, sure, that's cool. But like, isn't like 90% of playing quarterback like making simple decisions and completing like 10-yard passes? Like, it's great he does these 10% things, but like the majority of playing the position is like doing the simple stuff and making somewhat complicated things look easy.
Yeah, well, that's part of your thing with the baseball analogy for batting average. I think that's part of it too. Like, the simple thing, if you can do it 8 out of 10 times instead of 7.5 out of 10 times, like your eye can't necessarily differentiate that, but that's going to make a huge difference on the efficiency. But just wait till Shanahan fixes Sam Darnold and he's leading them to the Super Bowl this year. Then you'll get a taste of that this year. Okay, let's skip ahead. So I mentioned Ted Knutson, friend of the pod, Ted Knutson also, and then Luke Borman here as being people who've kind of been on the inside also with these organizations. You spoke to each of them as part of this book. And I guess maybe I wanted to use them as the idea of, okay, we've penetrated the fortress here. We're inside. We're doing some things. We're having some influence. What's happening or not, we don't really know. You don't really know which teams, but I think like especially Bourne in particular is like high enough up where his stuff is not being, you know, put in the circular file immediately as they're doing kind of research and not getting any play off of it. But how has it gone? Like, is there an idea that it's worked? Is there an idea that it hasn't worked? I'm sure we can pick out anecdotes in either direction if we want to prove our point. But what are your general feelings about like the idea of how things have gone so far for those who have had influence, bringing this type of analytical perspective?
So I think beyond those two, I think most people that work in analytics at clubs are pretty frustrated still that they have very little influence on what's happening, which I
Mhm.
imagine is probably not super dissimilar to what I would think a lot of people in the NFL would probably say.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah.
So it's similar to that, right? Because you just, in baseball, whether this is good or bad, I don't know, probably not good. But like every baseball GM is like an analytics like guy that went to an Ivy League school, right? So like there's a top down kind of like mandate to think a certain way, I guess.
They're
Or
checking all the boxes for hateability, basically.
yeah, exactly. While in soccer, it's like you're fighting, you're convincing a lot of people, like, I didn't go to college, you are very skeptical of numbers because they've never really been a part of the sport, and it's really hard to make an influence. I think Ted, his company is being used by like almost any team worth its salt is paying for their data because they've know what to measure, and they also have figured out interesting ways to measure things that are really hard to measure without expensive tracking cameras in your stadium. But Ted worked for Brentford for a little bit, and Brentford is they're run by a sports bettor, so that's one of the few top down teams that have this approach. But Ted kind of got pilloried in the English media for like leaning on a post during training, because apparently that's like not a thing you're supposed to do.
Yeah, I've seen it's crazy those sorts of things that end up happening. I mean, I don't know. Like, I should ask Ted about that if the next time I talk to him. Like, I don't know what you do in that situation. Like, do you laugh? I mean, like, what, because it's uncomfortable. That's the thing I think people have a trouble, like, really imagining is how uncomfortable it is when people hate your guts, even if it's totally irrational.
Yeah, it's not that I've had anything to that level, but I wrote a piece like last summer, maybe it was, just being like, what if we had a better box score for soccer? Because you've seen, right? Like at halftime, they like list possession. You might get shots on target. You usually only get shots. Then it's like corner kicks, fouls, yellow cards, and it's like, no, like this isn't helping anyone. And
I like when they put the thing in the corner, and in the corner, and they'll have like the number of shots, and then they have a bar to indicate. I'm like, whoa, 3-2.
Yeah.
Like, thank you for that,
exactly.
for that color bar that we have there to tell us that.
Yeah. And writing the piece, I was like, okay, I understand like why baseball kind of keeps its box score, because it's like a historical thing, and you have all of you going back. So, like it's important, like little totem or whatever. But I was like, okay, soccer, no one gives a shit about stats at all. So like if I'm going to disrupt the box score, like no one's going to care. So I was like, okay, what if we do expected goals, touches in the penalty area, percent of touches in the final third, and like one or two other things, just kind of simple stuff that like gives a snapshot of what happened in the game. And the number of I got like so many burning American flag like gifts sent to me over that article, of mostly people who like definitely didn't read the piece because it was like an ESPN Plus article. So like but like there was a massive pushback to just like this idea of like adding a couple numbers to a box score at halftime of a soccer game. So there's just like, that speaks to me. It clearly spoke to something, right? That there's like this innate distrust of either innate distrust or innate like conservatism about like the game is meant to be looked at this way. We should never change it. So when that happens, you just kind of have to laugh at it, I think.
I think so. But then you'll go to like that one of those dudes, you go to their Twitter, and then if they have a stat that they like that says that their club is better than you think, they're like, oh, I love this. this is fantastic.
Yes. Yeah. Without fail. But so like Luke Bourne, he worked for AS Roma in Italy, and they made the Champions League semifinals, and they had an American owner at the time. And to me, from the outside, it was kind of like, oh, well, this is what you get. You invest in, you hire a smart guy and kind of try to do things differently. You can make the Champions League semifinals. And then I talked to Luke, and he was like, yeah, I barely impacted anything. Their coach was Luciano Spalletti, the manager of Napoli, who just won Serie A, kind of shockingly, I guess, because of their resources compared to their competitors. And Luke was like, yeah, he made me a bunch of cappuccinos, but like didn't listen to a word I had to say. And this is like
Maybe it
Luke is
was
like
maybe it was sinking in. Maybe it was like so there
yeah,
there
maybe
was
it's it.
this osmosis going on or something. I
But
don't know.
Luke
Yeah.
is like the most like as accomplished of an academic and like sports analytics person that there is. So like if
Right. He
he
worked for the
can't have any
Kings.
impact,
He's the head of Zealous, I guess, now when he's doing a bunch
yeah.
of work there. So yeah, yeah.
So he then went to the Kings, which is just funny to me because like Vlade Divac was the
Yeah.
GM of the Kings while he was there, and
I love
there's
Lade.
one Getty.
Just
There's a
ripping
Getty
cigs,
picture of
just
them
ripping cigs during
talking. Like I
halftime, probably.
wish I could hear the conversations they have with each other. But then he hit, and along with a group including Billy Bean, they bought Toulouse in the second division in France. And first year they, you know, the whole my shit doesn't work in the playoffs thing actually became real because they made it to the promotion playoffs in to get to League One, and they lost on an away goal tiebreaker. So they, tied their playoff over two legs, but the other team scored more away goals, so they didn't advance. And then last year they won the league pretty easily. I think they set a record for goals scored. They got promoted. This was their first year, and they just won the French League Cup, which is funny because League Cups are very weird because they're like only sort of taken seriously by the teams that are in it until they get farther in. And then once you get to like the semis or quarters, you kind of take it seriously. But I think like most, like someone like Luke, you look at a cup where it's like you have to win 5 or 6 games and it's like, it's pretty random. We're not going to like look at cup success as a measure of our, how well our team's doing. But so it's kind of funny that they ended up winning the cup, but they're like mid-table in first and in Lyon, and they have a very young team, play like a very aggressive style. So that seems like it's going really well. And now they also are running AC Milan. So this is kind of their first year involved there. So I think it's a little too early to say if they're having any impact at all there yet. But
he's part of a group.
Well.
He's part of a group that Billy Bean is involved with also, correct?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So they also has that name brand connection there. It's interesting. I have a bunch more questions. Again, I'll get it to you for my potentially disastrously dumb takes at the end. And then I want to talk about Jesse Marsh, who's also a character in here. Sacked. I never know, should I use these British terms or not? Because you know what they've done, and which is smart, is I remember reading, what was it called? Is it called The League? Whatever the Premier, the book about the Premier League. And they mentioned how they wanted to make it seem authentic by having all British announcers and other stuff. So like, I was very confused. I'm like, am I supposed to call it Premier League or do I call it Premier League? I don't even know what I'm supposed to be doing. It's like, and they're sacked, pace, all these different terminology there. What do you do? Do you use like the American equivalent, or do you go with the British or the English terminology?
I tend to use the American equivalent, and then I'll use the Britishisms if I need to vary up my language within a piece, I guess. Because to me, playing soccer and being like one of the few people I knew growing up that was like finding ways to watch the Champions League, like I find the American that like calls it football to be super annoying still.
So like, well, that's the class thing. I think that's the class thing also. Like, again, and like part of my contrarian resistance to even getting into soccer in the first place is it's just like some fucking Brooklyn guy or something, is like into, I'm getting up and going to the bar to go watch whatever. I'm just like, fuck this guy. And it's so funny to think that in some place else, it's like hooligans, it's like the lowest of the low are the fans there. So,
I say call it whatever you want. I lean toward just using the terms I use for other sports.
Okay, so well, Marsh, he was let go by Leeds, which again, but my big take when it comes to coaching is like I don't think it matters. Like generally, in most sports, maybe football to a little bit more of a degree because there's a lot of stuff that we don't actually see, and you are like using the players more like chess pieces in a way. So how you're diagramming it. But I think it's interesting. You have this whole section, or I think a whole chapter on Marsh there, and he was let go, and the Leeds did get a lot worse. But I don't even know whether to attach the two. But that's definitely something where I look at the narratives around certain coaches, and I just think there's such a huge confusion when it comes to variance, when it comes to how good the players are. You know, it can't like happen to be that Pep Guardiola is the greatest coach ever and he just happens to have the greatest players also. You know, like what's the likelihood that he, independent of players, he's really the greatest coach? Probably pretty small, right? That he's actually that. So like, how did you identify Marsh as someone you wanted to write about, and what sort of like real kind of traits can we point to when thinking about coaching to identify someone who might be giving their team more of an edge than someone else?
Yeah, I think the whole coaches thing, crediting coaches thing, is a bigger problem in soccer than any other sport, probably.
Yeah.
Like you'll frequently, I'm sure you've seen, like after a game, you'll hear about how, you know, Mikel Arteta masterminded a victory over X team, as if like he's controlling all of the players. And like, it's soccer. It's like in football, at least there are plays that they can practice before the game, right?
Yeah.
In soccer, it's just like the managers are like pathetic, right? On the sideline, they're just like screaming and like going like this, and it's like the players are just making decisions on the field. You know what I mean?
I mean, you could just pull like 11 random players from different leagues, put them on a field, and they would figure it out. Like they would figure out how to play. You know, like they don't need the coach diagramming the plays for them or whatever. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Especially like Real Madrid like wins the Champions League every year, and they like famously like they're kind of just like a roll the ball out there type team, and they win.
Yeah.
And I wonder why, you know?
Yeah.
So I think players get like somehow don't get anywhere near enough credit in soccer, which I find just to be strange. But I guess it's such a complex sport, and it's easier to identify with a coach, right? As someone who's not playing the sport. I think one interesting thing about Pep is like soccer, the disadvantage in terms of trying to analyze it in the same way, say, you analyze the NFL, is that like the talent levels are so vastly unequal across the sport, and the resources are so unequal. So it's like when you're watching a game, it's like, at least if there's in the NFL, like you kind of are like watching teams that are like have roughly the same constraints on how they can build a team, and they've found all these different ways to get more performance out of those constraints than everyone else. You like roughly know that that's what you're seeing in the NFL. While with soccer, it's like you watch Manchester City play Brentford, and it's like most of the discrepancy here is financially based, right, between these two teams. So I think that also makes it hard to judge managers, because I think like when you can select from the absolute top tier talent pool, I think you probably have certain ways of playing available to you that you wouldn't have available to you if you were coaching a team down in the league, which I think is kind of makes it really hard to even decide if Pep Guardiola is the best coach ever, because what does that even mean? I think with him, I say he's definitely the best at maximizing top tier talent. Like I feel like he does get a little bit extra out of the talent where he has more talent than anyone else, because the amount that he wins is just absurd compared to everyone else, especially over the 38 game season. So he's doing it very consistently. His issues tend to be in cup competitions. But Jesse Marsh, so, you know, in terms of like analytical ways of playing, I think the one that kind of stands out potentially to me is kind of the high pressing approach, where you don't worry about possession as much. You worry more about territory, and you worry about keeping the ball as far away from your goal as possible rather than protecting your goal, if that makes any sense. Yeah. And I think that feels analytical to me, because it is kind of like the NFL, right? Where it's like going for it on fourth down, like looks terrible when it doesn't work out. But the idea is like, it's like a betting strategy, right? Like your expected value over time, you're going to win more games because you go for it. Even though the times it fails, it looks stupid, right? And you're going to get pilloried for it on TV. And I think pressing is kind of it fits that same idea, right? Because it's like you're pushing all your defenders up, have all your attackers, you're kind of playing this hectic style. And sometimes you're just going to give up horrible looking goals because you have everyone pushed up, and you're going to like be dominating the game, and then suddenly it's going to be like a 3-on-2 and they're going to get a tap in your goal. But the idea is that over time, you're going to win points more often by playing this way. So I think that kind of fits with me. And Ted Knutson has said that, like, in terms of his research, that's like the highest EV way of playing that they've found. But that's hard because you have to convince your players to run like a lot than the other players, which not everyone wants to do. Also, it can lead to a lot of injuries. So there's all questions. with that. But Jesse Marsh is very much about this playing style. And in the book, I even think this is kind of an analytical way of thinking things. He's like, when I'm winning a game 1-0, I'm thinking about going up 2-0. Or if I'm winning 2-0, I want us to go up 3-0. I'm not trying to protect my lead, which I think over time would probably lead to more wins than getting more conservative when you have the lead. And so he plays this very kind of hectic pressing style and learned it as a coach at the Red Bull, yes, the energy drink network owned group of teams who Red Bull essentially just built like the greatest scouting network and all of these great teams by playing this kind of aggressive way that didn't really care as much about possession. And so I wanted to talk to Jesse because he was kind of schooled in this kind of modern sort of analytically based way of playing. I guess there's some studies about, you're most likely to score a goal 8 seconds after possession is turned over, stuff like that. So I wanted to talk to him about that. And I kind of, I asked him and he gave me like the greatest, I almost felt like he was pranking me because first question I asked him, I was like, so like, I always hear that like soccer is too dynamic of a game to be measured, right? Like that's what people that try to at least engage with the idea a little bit, right? They say it's too dynamic to really put any kind of numbers on it. And I was like, so like, can it be measured? And he told me this story, funnily enough, one of his best friends at Princeton is Mitch Henderson, who's the coach of the Princeton basketball team now, who became briefly famous because they did well in March Madness. And I guess he was working on some analytics project. And he just like, we're kind of measuring some stuff in basketball. Do you think this could happen in soccer? And Jesse was like, it's just too dynamic, too many moving pieces. Like maybe you can measure set pieces because that's like a kind of sheltered area of the game, but it's just too dynamic. And then he like paused for a second, then he laughed and he was like, and that was like the stupidest thing I've ever said. And so he, I think it's pretty rare to find a relatively accomplished coach who's going to be like, yes, like there's all kinds of things we can measure and haven't measured yet. And we should be thinking of these different ways to kind of figure out how to win better by measuring what's happening on the field. So that being said, he's been fired twice.
But guys just get fired all the time. Well, I wonder if that's part of the problem, because I think exactly what you're saying. Like my intuition would be, it's okay if you lose 4-0 and it looks horrible sometimes if you're going to end up with more points because of the way that you end up playing. But like that means you're playing a higher variance style of play, and higher variance style of play means it's more likely you go on a cold streak. And if it's more likely you go on a cold streak where you can get fired very easily, easier than I think in any of the American sports, these guys are fired, then it becomes very risk averse. So I think that's interesting that you mentioned that, because that would be one of my intuitions. Okay, maybe I'll get into some of these other intuitions now. So you can how do we solve these things here? Okay, so number one is the point system, right? You get 3 points for a win, 1 point for a draw, 0 for a loss. So like, how do we attack this asymmetry if you're in a game and it's a tie, right? Because being willing to lose is worth it to get a win, right? In these situations, like in these specific situations, I'm trying to think of ways, obviously playing more guys forward, doing other stuff. Do you think there's anything in that teams are too wedded to getting their point versus getting their 3 points, and you could really exploit that a lot in soccer somehow?
Yeah, I think that they, maybe not in that way in particular. I think teams tend to be, I think you see it, there's like score effects, it's called, where teams, when you get a lead, teams tend to perform worse, I guess, in terms of like just looking at like expected goals allowed and conceded, right? When teams get a lead, they basically start to play more conservatively. And when teams go behind, they start to play more optimally, I guess you could say. And that's like, that's like a really interesting thing, because I don't think that's purely coaching. I don't think coaches are just like telling their players to lock up and, kind of take their foot off the gas. I think you can kind of see it from like scoring goals is like a collection of like, I don't know, 100 different decisions go into each goal, right? Because you have the player making decisions on the ball, then you have all the other players on the field making different decisions that create all the space. And if you're winning, maybe your mindset when you're playing is like you're less likely to make the more aggressive decision. So then that like makes your team more likely or less likely to open up the space that could create a goal. Like I could see, even if you're like 1 or 2% less likely to be aggressive, it could have this team wide sort of exponential effect on your performance, right? So I think your intuition is correct. I don't know. And then I guess you can just like incentivize the contracts or something where like the team, like the more goals we win each game by, like a bonus goes out to everyone on the team or something like that. That's like the best thought that I've come up with. Cause I think you can like bang it into your players' heads, but I think for some reason it just like this a little bit of conservativeness tends to fit into professional players once they get a lead. I don't know why.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something that I find. We talked about the clean sheet thing earlier and the goalies. Like, we need to tell these goalies to chill out a little bit here. It seems like a cool position to play because you get to yell at everyone all the time and like nothing's your fault. But like, I think that's also kind of a little bit of a cultural issue. It's like you give up goals sometimes, man. It happens. Like, it's such a weight. It feels like such a burden, not only on the goalie, but just on the team generally. That like, I don't know what you do to stop that, but
think about, I'm sure maybe you haven't picked up on this yet, but you'll frequently be watching a game and a team will just be up like 3-0, right? And they're going to win. And then they give up a goal like at the end. And the announcers will talk about how they'll be disappointed they didn't keep a clean sheet. Yeah, and you'll hear the coach after the game be like, I'm disappointed we didn't keep the clean sheet. When it's like, who cares? Like you won the game by being aggressive and going up 3-0. Like, what does it matter that there was a 1 or a 0? Like, added to this thing right at the end of the game. Like, so there is just some weird, like, I guess, a clean sheet, like
it's like the guarantee championships. It's like, if you don't give up a goal, you literally cannot lose.
Yeah.
Like, if we do this, which of course you don't have very much control over, you have like very little control versus what you think of, we can't lose. So therefore just do that. And then maybe we get a goal and then we can only tie or win. And that's the end. I think that's maybe part of the philosophy, but I don't know. So that's a weird one. Okay. Another thing I'm thinking about. Okay. Like soccer is like obviously infamous for like diving. So I'm saying if you're attacking, less diving in the box. We need to stop diving in the box. Like, they don't give up penalties in the box. The refs know, like, they don't. There's like a much higher bar. More diving or equal diving outside of the box. And then on defense, stop fouling people if they're even not on your own half, but if they're anywhere close to the final third. Like, I see sometimes these very unnecessary fouls, which lead to a set piece, which lead to a goal all the time. And I'm just like, why did you do that? Like, it just doesn't make any sense to me in that particular play, but I don't know exactly how to get that out of the game. But my thought would be stop diving in the box, and then defensively outside of the box. Don't think because it's outside of the box, it's okay if you give up a free kick, essentially.
Yeah. So is your diving thing, this is you not wanting to see players dive, or like it's a strategic thing that you think it's bad?
A strategic thing. I think sometimes guys actually give up a little too easily, because they're trying to fall and not see what happens. I think there are more opportunities sometimes, even if maybe you were going to lose possession, for something to bounce around and then you get a second shot in some sort of way. I don't know. I just feel like the refs really don't give up a lot inside the box. Like, there's such a higher standard, at least what I've watched, that I'm wondering about that. Maybe I'm wrong. I could be very wrong. And maybe like the dive should be more a part of what guys are doing, or at least creating the contact, I guess. I don't know. Well, what do you think about either one of those? You can disagree with both or either or none.
It's tough because, like, to me, like, I make this joke sometimes that like Moneyball of soccer is just kicking the ball into the other guy's hand inside the penalty area. Like, that's the best way to actually.
I can give that to you. I'll give that to you. Yeah.
And especially like if you want to be cynical about it, right? If you're on the corner of the box, right, goal, probably scoring a goal like at absolute best would be 10% of the time from there, but it's probably lower. So if you can just dive and potentially turn that possession into a 3/4 goal by just diving and making it a penalty, you could probably do the math on figuring out like how often that would have to be rewarded versus a turnover for it to be worth it. Yeah. But I think you're probably right. You're definitely right that like contact in the box is, even with VAR, it's still like not awarded as much as it would be just right outside the box, like the same foul.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely the case, just like even maybe even more extreme than the NFL, where the officials' like initial ruling makes a huge difference as far as what the ruling. I mean, I've seen times where it was like clearly should have been a penalty, but it wasn't called a penalty, and they don't call it. And then if they do call it a penalty, as long as it fits the definition, which can be pretty expansive, much more expansive than what they actually call, then they always 100% award it.
Yeah, I think someone could probably study that and prove that it's correct.
Well, I guess maybe I'm even watching. Maybe Messi's just a freak, but I watch a lot of times where like he's not taking dives where he could be if he was a normal player.
He like never dives.
So I don't know, something about that. I kind of think maybe there's some edge to it, but I don't know. I could be totally wrong about that. Okay, so none of that.
But I think your other point I think is accurate. I think just from a like, if I could apply analytics to it, I think like the average free kick from the final third is more likely to lead to a goal than just the average open play possession. So like if you're a midfielder and you're just like fouling a guy and letting the possession turn into a set piece, especially if teams start to get better and better at set pieces, which they should, then it's pretty stupid, even though it's viewed like, I don't know, there's some like kind of like, well, it's like, this midfielder is going to let you know he's there kind of thing. Like he's not going to let you just dribble around in the final third. He's going to like make you leave the game with cleat marks as if that's like a good thing, but it's actually just kind of stupid. So I'm with you on players give up stupid fouls in the final third way too often.
Yeah. I'd also want to study like sometimes when there is an advantage, there's a little bit of an advantage in the final third, and they'll just like default take the penalty, where I'm like, I don't know, like what's the probability they really would have scored on that? I'm not sure. I don't know. I'd have to look at that more though, because maybe you should, but they do that a little too often just by default. They'll, get a card or whatever, and they'll just like take the penalty, where I'm not certain. Like I still think it's probably a very low probability goal sort of thing. Okay. So another idea I have, and this one I'm really not sure about, but I'm interested in, is that rather than letting the defense get set, like more often maybe taking low XG shots, but doing it in a manner like we mentioned earlier, this contextual manner, if you can like set up to really get a good shot in a way where it's technically from a position on the field that's low XG, but maybe if you practice it a lot and you have it set up well, that you can get like a higher XG than what you really think and be less concerned about turning it over and starting over again, as opposed to passing it around. The defense is totally set. They have the 5 men back. There's 6 men back there. Just being willing just to fire it up sometimes quicker and easier and faster and just start over again, even if you are a possession team. What do you think about that?
I agree. I don't think that like, isn't there like a term for like once you start to like, when there's like a metric and then you start to like form the metric, it makes the metric useless basically.
Yeah.
Like if you're just trying to create a tap in on the goal line with every possession, like it's probably going to make your team worse because you just can't do that every time, right? If like that's all you're doing and otherwise you're not shooting, like I think you're going to be worse than if you have a little more freedom in terms of shooting. And then I do think that like there's some coaches call it a POMO, so position of maximal opportunity, where like I think a thing you could train is the way players react to their teammates taking a shot. Because like if
that's always that's like the goalie thing. That's like the goalie thing I was talking about. Someone was open on every play. They're like, what's going on here?
Yeah, exactly. So rather than doing that, if your teammate's winding up to take a shot and you start crashing the goal, like you're probably going to score a couple extra goals a season, I would imagine. So if you can kind of combine those two things, like teach your attackers to kind of react to the shot being taken in a kind of proactive way. Because there's so many times where a keeper will maybe fumble a ball, and it's just totally up to like how the players happen to be standing when the shot's taken to who gets the rebound. While if like the attacking team just like crash the goal and use like the guy winding up as some kind of marker that they should run toward the goal, I think you'd score a good deal extra number of goals a season. And then if the opposition becomes aware of you doing that, that might then open up all the space for the guy on the ball, right? To maybe get a better shot off or drive the ball closer to goal. So I think that I don't know how you could like measure this. I'm sure there's ways you could measure it, but I think you're right that there's like, yes, it's better to take shots closer to goal on average, but I think there's definitely some strategic advantages to taking lower probability shots too.
I mean, I could be way off on this because I guess the analogy would be like the long shot has kind of gone away because it's like the long two in the NBA or something like that. So like intuitively you don't want to do it as much, but I've thought about also like how do you like if you could potentially it's like how the three-pointer became more and more of a thing in the NBA, not only because of its advantages, but players got even better at doing it in a sort of way. So if you could be better at doing it, it would be interesting. Okay, so another idea I have, the team's probably already thinking about this, but you know, on corner kicks, how it's like inverted kind of the field positioning for the players because they want all the big guys next to the goal. So often you're center backs and others and you're the goal. And then you have the smaller guys who are away from the goal who are generally not like the good defenders. Like, how do you take advantage of that if you're the defending team on the corner kicks to attack them back with guys like out of position, not knowing what they're doing? I'm not sure what it is, but I think there might be some way to concentrate, be more willing to give up goals on corner kicks so that you can counterattack right off of a corner kick more easily. But I don't know what that is, but that's something that I've thought about a lot.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right. Liverpool are particularly, in the past, they've been particularly good at scoring off of other teams' corner kicks. And I think teams like corner kicks are still like underutilized massively in soccer. And I think teams actually are afraid of giving up goals while they're taking a corner kick, even just for like the same reasons, you know, coaches are afraid of bad things happening that almost never happen in every sport. I think that the easy way is just like, you can just make a gamble, right, of how many guys you leave, because you can leave like 10 guys up at the midway line and just like hope your, you know, keeper, you know, can come away with the corner kick or something, because they're not going to be offsides until they cross the midfield line. So like it's purely just a numbers game, right? Like how many guys do you want to leave up? Corner, the more you leave up, the more I think likely you are to score on a counterattack. So yeah, I think teams are like pulling too many guys back would be my guess. And pushing more guys would lead to more goals.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you said, like if you erase all the defenders, there's a certain percentage of the time that you would just not score, even if there were zero defenders. If you assume the ball comes in and you head it, and you either the ball's not there, like the ball's it's over their head, no one can get a good header, you head it out of bounds, you head it to the keeper, all these sorts of things. Like you literally did not need a defender there. I mean, of course they could control it if you didn't have a defender and then do that, but I'm just saying, you know what I'm saying? Like no one's actually going to be able to do that as long as you have some sort of presence. So it's like taking advantage of that fact that it's really like you're dealing with cases on the margins by playing defense there sometimes. More so. And then sometimes, like, even no matter how many guys you have there, just there's a certain amount of goals you can't prevent also on the other side. So you combine those two things together, and it's like you're having zero effect on all these potential different plays. Okay. Okay, maybe this is the last thing, and then I'll let you go. I'm also thinking about this from the perspective of, like, what's the right way to do things. And it seems to me that, like, I was looking at Brentford and Brighton as two teams that both, you know, they have like the sports bettors, the guys, they're both just analytical sort of thinkers. They do things in very, very different ways. I think that, like, I think Brighton, and we talk about coaching and everyone is like De Zerbi's now like the king, you know, like everyone loves him so much. I think they just have good players, honestly. Like, I think they have some really, really good players, and that's what they've been able to do there. But I also feel like the way that Brentford plays reminds me more of how you would be an analytical sort of team. But I'm wondering if it's like you can be an analytical sort of team, maybe in the same way of college football, and you could take advantage of something. But then there's a point at which you have to transition into having the skilled players to do more of the Brighton sort of thing if you want to continue to move on and be in that sort of way. So like, how do you get over that gap? And I'm wondering, if you are a team like Brentford, you have to look at some point kind of rotating out the way you do things if you can establish yourself in the Premier League to then go to the next level. Is there any of that, do you think?
Yeah, I think you're looking at it the right way. I think it's important to point out that Brentford has a decently smaller wage bill than Brighton. So yeah, they're working, like, if you look at wages, points per wages, they were points per dollar spent or whatever. Brentford was 1, Brighton was 2. But Brighton, I think, becomes the bigger story because they're finishing higher in the table, and finishing 9th for Brentford is like an incredible accomplishment, but they're 9th, so like no one cares. And I think you're right. Like, if you just take, so set pieces are like sometimes I hesitate to say this is an analytical thing, but like, you can just score more goals on set pieces without sacrificing any goals elsewhere. That's like a thing that like has been studied, and it's just true, and it's obvious, right? Like, that's
I think it's like where you put your time and effort practicing, basically, is trying to leverage that. Yeah. So that's an analytical thing. Set pieces,
you don't need that much training, basically, to do
it. Can't be fun. Like, it cannot be fun to practice.
For players, it's terrible. That's one thing I can absolutely
flying headers. Especially you can do the flying.
Someone who's not tall. I'm not tall, so I would just be standing, like, basically, like, back, like, just standing there, like, talking to my
waiting for the ball to come out so you can fire it over the net, and then everyone could be like,
but in, like, training, we would just stop once the ball came out, so we could then practice another one. So with set pieces, and then, like, taking shots closer to goal, and then preventing your opponent from taking shots closer to goal. Brentford, highest expected goals per shot, lowest expected goals per shot conceded, and they were second in expected goals total from set pieces this year. And that was with them not having that much possession. So I think Brentford is like the very clear finding the analytical way to play with their players.
Yeah.
And I think Brighton, what they do is they just find really good players by looking at data and kind of knowing, figuring out what might be predictive of Premier League success. And then also, like, doing this thing where they just, like, make a bunch of, like, $10 to $5 million bets on players in underutilized markets for talent. And a lot of them don't pan out, but then, like, 5 of them do. And then they suddenly have all these good players. And the other benefit of being Brighton as opposed to Brentford is the way Brighton plays is very appealing to all of the teams that are richer than Brighton. So, like, those players are playing a possession-based style and attacking style that all of the big teams play.
Right. So it's like a pipeline. It's like a pipeline. They can.
So they see these players and they're like, oh, this guy's good enough to play for us. Just by nature of him being good enough to play for us, here's $50 million for this guy that you paid $5 million for.
In fact, more likely to overpay also for these guys, which I think we've seen, and we might see with McAllister. I have a feeling also, but
that's a good inversion of Liverpool formerly being the smart analytical team, and now Brighton being the smart analytical team and taking advantage of Liverpool potentially. Not that I don't think McAllister could be decent on Liverpool, but that gets into a whole other thing about how do you even know what a good midfielder is. And then with Brentford, it's like they're definitely maxing out their talent as much as they can, but they also just don't really have players that like the other teams want, I think, partially because the way that they play doesn't like inflate the perception of their value to the big teams, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. I mean, I kind of think of like sometimes you have like big, fast, and skilled, or maybe like 3 different ways to think about these guys. And the cheapest way is to get the bigger, kind of faster guys. But eventually, the Man Cities of the world have guys who are like all three basically. Like their whole team is big, fast, and skilled. And it's just like they're willing to have a player who's small, who is like super ridiculously skilled, but they're not necessarily willing to have players who are super ridiculously big and fast who aren't skilled at all, other than, you know, maybe like, I don't know where you want to put Haaland in this discussion, but there's only room for one of them on the whole squad. So
they have one massive guy who's not that skilled, and then they have one tiny guy who's incredibly skilled in Bernardo Silva, and then everyone else is pretty big, pretty skilled, and pretty athletic.
So, Bernardo Silva is like the perfect example of the guy that walks by you on the street that you just be like, this guy is the athlete. This guy's the ridiculous killer
but
athlete.
But then it's also like he can like run and he can like sprint for like 90 minutes straight too. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like an insanely athletic trait. Also,
definitely. Okay, I've taken up all your time here. I appreciate this. I'll bug you in the future maybe to talk about some more stuff as my continued involvement. I guess I continue to evolve into a soccer only site and podcast and podcast. But again, for everyone still hanging on here, buy the book. I got the book here. Excellent read. I appreciate it so much. And thanks for your time, Ryan.
Thanks for having me.